Thank you. Thank you so much, Gözde. Thank you, Yelena, for organizing. Thank you to everyone who showed up on a Friday afternoon. I'm so impressed. I hope you find this topic as fascinating as I do. As Gözde said, I'm working on a book under contract with Cambridge University Press on a sort of pop culture as an identity contestation sphere. So we're going to be looking at media as a place in which authoritarian parties or autocratizing parties can consolidate their power, can build their base, can spread their vision for the nation that they would like to realize, and can erase opposition voices. As she said, I work on Turkey, but this, I hope, will be of interest for people who work in other regions. So I want this to be a broadly comparative talk. We'll be, of course, drawing from the case of Turkey, but it's not at all alone in the way in which it uses media tools to consolidate the power of the ruling party. That's the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, which has been in power since 2002 and recently won its next successive election over and over and over in 2023. So this is a party that has presided over an increasingly competitive authoritarian regime. In fact, some say that competitive authoritarianism doesn't really cut it anymore. When you look at the playing field and specifically access to media, as we'll talk about, we can't even really consider it competitive authoritarian anymore. So I'm going to advocate for the use of media as a way to understand authoritarianism. And in fact, I'm going to be talking not just about news media, but entertainment media as well, which I take incredibly seriously because governments do too. And they put all kinds of restrictions on it, and they put all kinds of money into producing their own popular culture content. So I think we as political scientists or sort of whatever discipline we come from can make a very strong case that the media and even entertainment media is an incredibly political sphere that we should think about in addition to elections and courts and all those other kind of traditional focuses of political science. So in my talk, I wanted to thank my Balkan, or whatever sort of way we define the Balkans. Veronica, of course, put me in touch with Elaine in the first place. A shout out to some of the Balkan elements of this media projection. TRT Balkan was one of the state television outlets. This is the 6th international media outlet that the Turkish state opened in 2021, broadcasting in Macedonian, Albanian, and Bosnian. And then, of course, we have some Balkan themed disease. Don't call them soap operas. They're as many people will encourage you not to. These are TV series. They last about 2 hours. They are produced at the rate of 1 a week. So one of the things that I'll talk about, or that we can talk about in the Q&A, is the way in which these television series can respond to ongoing political events. They can incorporate and respond to political developments because they are produced at such a fast-paced rate. Okay, so here we go in terms of thinking about why a media lens on authoritarianism. As I said, in political science, we tend to think more traditionally about political parties and elections and courts and security services and militaries and all that kind of stuff. But I want to make the case that media is an incredibly powerful empirical window through which to understand authoritarian consolidation, as well as an incredibly powerful political tool by which these parties can consolidate their rule. Give a couple examples. In the 2023 elections, there was a study done looking at the coverage in a particular month, and the incumbent, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, received 32 hours of coverage on the state television station, Turkish radio and television, the state broadcaster. The opposition candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, received 32 minutes. And it's just convenient that those numbers tend to be the same, so I think it sticks in your brain. But I think it's also a very clear disparity in terms of the amount of election coverage that was allocated to the incumbent on what was a state and should not be a party or partisan television station. So I think that's one way of understanding how media can affect elections. When we look at the political economy of the private media, and I'll talk about how this works in terms of ownership structures, we see that about 90 to 95% of private media, so we talked about TRT, the state outlet, but of private media, 90 to 95% is tied to the ruling party. What you have in Turkey, as you have in many other countries, are conglomerates or holding companies that have construction interests and banking interests and mining interests. in addition to owning television stations and owning newspapers. And because they want the low interest loan, because they want the tender to build the next airport, because they want to be able to have access to be able to mine in areas that perhaps were restricted, they have favorable ties with the government, and they use their media television stations, in terms of television stations and newspapers, to air favorable coverage of the party. So in that way, they use the television stations primarily to show pro-government coverage, and then they get these kickbacks. So we can think of like a crony capitalism in the media. So that, I think, is important from a private perspective. This is a common statistic that is often given, that Turkey, in the last few years, has often topped the lists of the leading jailer of journalists, according to Reporters Without Borders. Currently, over 100 journalists are in jail. In the past year, about 240 have been detained. Not all end up going to jail, but it is a process of harassment, intimidation, and all kinds of different tactics that are used in order to try to silence journalists. So again, this is clearly connected to political coverage. And then I think it's worth noting that in one of the most iconic scenes of political contestation in Turkey, the Gezi Park protests in 2023, which was an unprecedented nationwide uprising. 80 of 81 provinces saw some kind of mass protest. In the Gezi Park protest, which started initially as an environmental protest to save Gezi Park from being razed and having an Ottoman barracks-themed shopping mall put in its place, but quickly became a protest against police brutality when the small group of protesters was attacked by security forces and their tents were burned, but also when the media refused to cover it. So the symbol of the Gezi Park protests, one could argue there were several symbols, but one of the most prominent symbols was that of the penguin. So this was a picture that I took in Kulu Park in Ankara in 2013 during the Gezi Park protests, and people had lots of penguin balloons that they were flying from their car windows. You had penguin icons, you had penguin costumes. The reason for the penguin was that during the height of the protests, when there was a lot of violence being used against protesters in Gezi Park, CNN Turk was showing a penguin documentary, and the other sort of international outlets were showing coverage of the actual events themselves. And so the fact that they were showing a penguin documentary became this sort of iconic symbol. The penguin became an iconic symbol of media censorship. And one intrepid journalist actually took a photo of two television screens showing CNN Turkey with the Penguin documentary, CNN International with the actual coverage of events. This was then satirized by many, as one does, in order to show the penguin on their sort of melting iceberg watching what's happening in Turkey, and the person in Turkey with the protests going on around them, watching the penguins, neither aware of their own demise, right? So again, sort of looking at the way in which the penguin became the symbol of censorship. So clearly, the opposition is paying attention to the fact that media is being censored. The government is increasingly involved in this censorship. I say we take media more seriously. Now, why an entertainment lens in particular? Of course, a lot of political scientists already look at news media as they should, and of course, they also look at social media as they should. But if we think about what television and music and film and other forms of entertainment media that the government regulates, that the government funds, that the government censors, that it fines, you can think of television content or culture content in general or more broadly as a regime legitimation tool of airing content that is in line with the morals, the national vision, the particular image of, say, the ideal woman, the sort of celebration of the accomplishments of the regime, lots of different ways in which that content can align with the rhetorical stuff that you're hearing in the speeches and the campaigns and so forth. But when you're seeing it in a fictionalized environment, it's a bit more innocuous. It's not directly political. You don't necessarily realize that you are being given content that is in line with the regime. A very quick example of that is a study that I've done on gender norms in cooking shows, whereby I find that the description of the ideal woman in these cooking shows, which are hosted, for example, by women who don't conform from a visual standpoint to the regime's ideal. They don't cover their hair. They have been divorced several times. They're very approachable girl next door types, but they are telling women to have at least 3 children. They're telling women to stay in the home. They're telling women they need to maintain good relationships with their mother-in-laws and keep the nuclear family intact and please the husband and so forth. So it doesn't sound overtly political, but it's innately and inherently tied to the biopolitics of the AKP. So that's just one example. When it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to domestic politics as well, we see this as a regime legitimation tool, and I'm happy to talk about more examples. When we're talking about foreign policy and the use of culture content abroad, which I'll talk about extensively a little later, we often think about this as a soft power cultivation tool, and this has been written on extensively, that the AKP has used television shows in particular to try to sort of support what was called its strategic depth policy, which was an idea or sort of a doctrine in the mid-2000s in Turkey that was meant to take advantage of the cultural, historical, religious ties that Turkey had with many of its neighboring countries that it has sort of been cut off from under previous regimes that didn't really want to have close ties with Middle Eastern countries, for example. So this was a strategy of trying to reinitiate, recultivate those ties, and television was used as a form of doing so. I'll give a couple examples of that in a bit. It can also very much be used as a tool of opposition marginalization. If you look at the ways in which Kurdish language would not appear, if you look at the ways in which prior to the AKP, headscarfed women would not appear in television shows, there's an erasure of particular identities that can happen when you have a regime that has so much control over both the private and the public media. This can also be used to paint opposition groups in negative ways. And so you can have someone who was a Gezi Park protester as a character in a television show, and they're drinking alcohol, and they're defying their parents, and they're basically messy individuals, right? So there's a way of painting political protesters as morally not fitting our social values, our social fabric, and so forth, as others. So it can be a vilification tool as well. And then it can also, tied to opposition marginalization, it can justify the use of repression. So I'll give an example. From the Gezi Park protests, or related to the Gezi Park protests, is Osman Kavala, who is a philanthropist and civil society activist who's been jailed along with many others in what was called the Gezi Park case, a court case against individuals who were accused of overthrowing the regime by supposedly funding the Gezi Park protests. Osman Kavala became sort of the iconic figure of this case, and shortly afterwards, a television show came out on Tabi, which is the state digital streaming platform that vilifies a character not called Osman Kavala, but as you can see, very, very much resembles him. So on the right-hand side, you have the character. On the left-hand side, you have actually Osman Kavala. So it's very clear that they're trying to depict him physically. And they paint him as a capitalist who made his money by nefarious means and ties to the West. And there's this conspiratorial plot that the West is engaged in order to overthrow the Turkish government. And this guy is at the center of it. So they're basically taking the charges that they used against him to jail him, and they're making a television show about it to communicate to the public that this guy is a villain and he's evil and dangerous and he needs to be in jail, right? So a very, very direct correlation between politics and television. Of course, this is not the focus today, but on the opposite side, on the opposition side, you can also look at the ways in which popular culture can be used as a creative resistance tool, from rap videos to, as we were talking about early, kind of the subversive, sly ways of inserting critique into television shows that the censors might not catch. So we have to think about sort of what does the media playing field look like? What are the formal tools that regimes have in order to be able to control the type of content that is on the airwaves, whether it's TV or film or music. I'm going to focus mostly on TV here, but I'm happy to talk about others in the Q&A. So TRT, as I said, that is the state television station. This is heavily funded. There are now TRT Kurdish language, TRT Arabic language. You have numerous different language platforms that are being used to cultivate particular senses of identity and nationalism in the content that is shown. TRT in particular has been the host of many what are called neo-Ottoman programs. I'm not the biggest fan of the word neo-Ottomanism, and the government does not like the use of neo-Ottomanism, but we can, at least briefly here, use it to kind of encompass this sense that the Turkish nation gets its legitimacy from Ottoman legacies, from being the previous home of the caliphate. There are obviously different definitions of Turkish nationalism. There are those who say that it comes more from the Central Asian tribes, like much earlier roots. But neo-Ottomanism is really kind of looking at why Turkey should have a large role in the region and should be looked at as this sort of Sunni hegemon in the region because of its former seat as sultanate and caliphate. And many of these programs are on TRT. They're funded by the Ministry of Culture, and they're distributed via state channels. RETÜK is the national regulatory board. So the Supreme Board of Radio and Television is responsible both for allocating sort of how much of this is broadcast per day, what's on this channel, and so forth. But mainly it's a regulatory board that issues fines, that interprets whether content is acceptable. And if so, it can go forward. If not, we can either issue a fine or we can ban it. And those are often like a 2-week ban, so it'll be like a suspension. The thing about this is that not only is it punitive, but it's also a deterrent. You see a lot of conversations among producers and screenwriters or scriptwriters about, I don't think we should include that because we don't want to run the risk. So what happens is once you have these punitive policies in place, there's a self-censorship mechanism that happens amongst the screenwriters or the producers that say, we don't want to necessarily incur that. We're going to lose advertising. We can't afford to. This is incredibly competitive TV market. We need to make sure that we stay on air or we're going to lose viewers. I'll talk about in a sec why this is such a competitive market, such that people are very hesitant about the kind of content that they show. RETÜK is made up of, its structure of the board is based on the number of seats you have in parliament. So because the AKP has the most seats in parliament and because its Nationalist Action Party ally has some seats, they basically have the majority of this board, which means that every decision in the board basically reflects the ruling party. And so this is stacked politically in favor of the incumbent, and so can, of course, again, be used to support regime policies. You see lots of bans or fines on shows that are seen to mock religion. The Simpsons, for example, got a big fine for seeing to engage in blasphemy. You have to blur out any images of alcohol. On cooking shows, for example, which I'm obsessed with, you have to refer to wine as fermented grape juice. You can't use the term wine. And so there's just a lot of ways in which the ideology of those who are placed on the board by these ruling parties or by the ruling party and its ally are reflecting, again, the kinds of nation that they want to create. Lots and lots of social media regulation. In 2020, the parliament passed a law that internet companies have to have a local presence within Turkey, and they have to store their data in country. That was meant to facilitate and even accelerate the extent to which the government can make requests for content to be removed. Turkey is also known as one of the most frequent countries requesting that content be removed from Facebook, from Twitter, and so forth. This was meant to expedite that. And in 2022, you have a disinformation law that allows for the jailing for up to 3 years of someone who is seen to be spreading disinformation that can incite fear or negative emotions in the public, something that can disturb national order, essentially. And of course, this can be interpreted very, very loosely. And so a journalist who was investigating the National Intelligence Bureau, for example, was arrested and his sentence was upheld by the Constitutional Court. During the pandemic, those that were the late stages of the pandemic, after the earthquake, some people were prosecuted for disinformation. So that's going to increasingly restrict the ways in which individuals can express any kind of discontent with the government. And then, again, building on the social media regulation, Digital streaming licensing is also heavily regulated. So if you are a platform like Netflix, an international one, or something like Blue TV, a Turkish national one, you have to have a location in Turkey as well, and you can only show content if you are granted a license. And so an instance of this was a show called If Only, which was being developed by Netflix within Turkey. And the government would not grant a license because there was a gay character. And so Netflix and the producer decided, we're going to scrap this. We don't want to adjust our script. We're just going to ditch the whole thing. So there's Ece Yurgenç, who is the producer, of course, in front of a Pride march. So again, this is another way in which the government can kind of enforce its policies. They ban the Pride parades on the streets, and then they use their tools to eliminate the presence of gay characters on television. Informal tools are also very important. Rhetoric, for example. Merely the president making a comment about a television show can be enough to get a discussion started in parliament, can be enough to intimidate producers and writers to say, I think this is becoming a big issue. I think maybe we need to pull back a little bit. So I think we need to take rhetoric very seriously. The crony capitalism that I mentioned earlier. So again, this is more informal, but it can have to do with the ways in which through privatization, particular holding companies are getting the television stations or newspapers that are being parceled out. A major holding company might go under or might be at risk of collapse, perhaps because an immense fine was placed on it. That was the case with the Doğan Media Group. And that was then purchased by a pro-government media group. So there's lots of ways in which there's kind of this consolidation of media within pro-government holding company hands. Again, the tenders that I mentioned, advertising as well. So state-related advertising makes up about 1/5 of total advertising revenue, and that is Turkish Airlines, Turkish Telecom, some of the state-run banks and so forth, Turkcell. So getting, being able to distribute that kind of wealth gives you quite a lot of power as well. And so television stations are, they're not necessarily going to be airing content that is against the government line. A couple of other techniques that I found in my own research is the use of blacklists. So if actors are tweeting things that the government doesn't like, they will no longer be given ad space. They will no longer be hired by casting crews and so forth. So that again leads to sort of self-censorship because you want to continue to do your craft and make a living and you can't if you were on a blacklist. Clandestine detainments where they show at your door at 4 a.m. and they take you into custody and they say, if you do not pay this bribe, we're going to tell everyone that you're a Gülenist, that you're a terrorist, and your reputation is going to be ruined for forever. So pay the bribe, shut up, and you can go. That's happened to a number of artists that I've interviewed. And I just wanted to include a really quick quote. This is from Zeynep Tüfekçi's Twitter and Tear Gas. I first censor myself, then my editor censors me, and then the owners of the newspapers. And if something's published anyway, especially in Defiance, someone from the government calls our boss. And I don't usually use long quotes, but I thought that was really indicative of the many layers of censorship. So super quickly, how does this work? How does power projection happen at home? The series The Magnificent Century was one of the most popular series. And again, it was on this Ottoman theme. However, it had a lot of women and cleavage and concubines and, women engaged in palace intrigues, and potentially wine was being drunk. They said it was sweetened fruit juice. This was not the kind of Ottomanism that the government wanted to see. And so the president, then prime minister, spoke out against this and said, we don't know Sultan Süleyman like that. This is Sultan the Magnificent, or the lawgiver in Turkish. We don't know a figure like that. This is tarnishing our history. This is trashing our national values. And so the show then reacted, and soon afterwards, one of the main female characters shows up with her hair covered and much less cleavage, and she is praying in the Muslim fashion. So again, I talked about how shows can sort of react quickly. That was done in order to stay on air. They received some penalties. Their content was taken off of Turkish Airlines in-flight programming. Not only are there restrictions against, or kind of, again, formal and informal tools used against content that is out of line with national values according to the regime, but then the production aspect kicks in. So you have the policing and then you have the production. And here you have immense state resources being put into a television show that was produced by a holding company, or that is produced by a production company owned by a member of the AKP. That was, Erdogan visited the set. He was given a private screening. So here I'm just kind of outlining the very direct links between this content and the political party itself. So this is Dirilish Ertuğrul, or Resurrection Ertuğrul, which tells the story of the father of the founder of the Ottoman Empire. So a very, very different version of Ottomanism is seen in that show. Everybody is chaste. There's no scenes of alcohol. There's no scenes of cleavage. It's very, very nationalist. The Crusaders are the enemy. It's very, very clear that there's an anti-Christian bias in this as well. You'll often see anti-Semitism in some of these programs too. Projecting power abroad. So Turkey's the #2, perfect, TV exporter. It is an incredibly lucrative industry, not only after the US, of course. Not only does it export television shows, but it also exports documentaries talking about how Turkish soap operas changed the world, is the title of this particular documentary, which interviews many women who say that they felt sort of empowered by watching these shows, that they found so many common elements across food and family and culture and all these kinds of things. This is a documentary that was produced, or that was aired by Al Jazeera, which is, of course, a Qatari news agency. Turkey and Qatar have very close relations, so it's not a stretch to think that this is meant to sort of promote the Turkish television industry. There's also a number of cultural and comparative and international political economy factors that shape the regime's ability to project abroad. As I said, the Turkish television industry is incredibly competitive, so they're often looking for revenues coming from abroad. And there's this sort of cultural affinity that a lot of populations that are the target, that are the receivers of these shows, find in these programs. But it's also the case that it was filling a gap that was arising because of kind of Syria's withdrawal from the space. Around the time of the Syrian civil war, Syria had been one of the main producers of television content for the Arab world, and Turkey kind of conveniently took that spot. Clear government links, as I said, between members of the party, these holding companies, these production companies, and in fact, sometimes the actors in these shows would accompany, so there you have Emine Erdogan, who's the wife of President Erdogan, would accompany the party on trips. This was a trip to Qatar, for example. So you're sort of having these celebrities be advocates or ambassadors of the cultural project that the regime is engaging in. And then what does this produce in terms of power? Massive amounts of tourism that come just from television shows. The number of people who show up in Istanbul for tours of the houses in which these television shows are filmed is immense. Exports, this went from revenues of $100,000 in 2008 to over $500 million in 2020. So this is a massive source of income as well. And it underscores Erdogan's sort of role as Muslim leader, which you see in many places. So you have sort of this affinity for Turkey, for Erdogan, because of the appeal of these shows. And then lastly, I wanted to conclude with sort of a challenge to the efforts to sort of use this soft power and project the AKP's image of Turkey abroad, and give the example of the Gulf Cooperation Council crisis that happened in 2017, 2018, when Turkey attempted to break the blockade that the GCC had placed on Qatar for its support of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. Turkey also the AKP, I should say, is quite in line with the Muslim Brotherhood and has hosted Hamas on its soil until recent events. So there's many ties that both share with that. So Turkey was showing support to Qatar. As a result, in March of 2018, a channel director that I interviewed at MBC, which is one of the largest broadcasting corporations in Saudi Arabia, majority owned by the Saudi state, is pulling all of its Turkish content. So the channel director tells me, I get a call and they tell me you have to pull all the Turkish content. And I look up and I'm like, what do I do? Because 85% of my programming is Turkish content. So that's, I think, indicative of how much the Turkish material has penetrated international markets. But this was a massive, again, revenue cut, a massive obstacle to that soft power promotion. So in 2019, the UAE produces a show called Kingdoms of Fire, which was, as its producer said to me in an interview, meant to counter Ottoman tyranny, retell that era from an Arab perspective, and take away the ability of those who colonized us to tell our stories. So this was sort of a cultural pushback at the efforts of the Turkish government to try to impose their own narrative. And then lastly, there was a fatwa that Egypt's religious authority issued against Turkish programming as well. So you're starting to see multiple ways in which that power can be challenged. This, of course, tells us something about the regional implications of the attempt to use television as a cultural projection tool, in addition to a revenue stream. But I think it also gives us a number of comparative examples to think of. And in fact, MBC ended up broadcasting newly created Saudi-produced content that filled the gap, eventually filled the gap of some of that Turkish content. So again, looking at different countries' uses of media as a way of trying to tell their own stories. So for more, I hope that you stay tuned. And if you're interested in the opposition perspective, please see my article, The Empire's Opposition Strikes Back, Popular Culture as Creative Resistance Tool. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.